the sky. The Man Who Japed. The world Jones made about a man who lives either always a year in the past or a year in the future. You can't tell the difference. Solar Lottery, his first published novel. It's again one of the early magazines. Real pulp stuff. But that's a great story, The World She Wanted, about reality. Every time they came out with a new edition, they would change the cover so that people wouldn't remember having bought the book. He wrote so many stories for so long. He was publishing a new story on the average of every other week for the first 3 years of his writing life. He was brilliant. But what a joy it is to have that whole smorgasbord of all the books and everything laid out, everything Dick has done. You can spend your life reading Phil Dick.
People who have studied his work, people who were inspired by him, people who have followed in his footsteps, people who admire him, people who can all testify to the fact that Philip K. Dick is here.
Philip K. Dick is everywhere.
He's one of those writers who, somebody who never met him can read him and think, I know this guy. And they do. He does come through very purely in his books.
There are more ideas per paragraph than there are entire novels by other people. I mean, they're just, you know, he will throw away an idea.
I have not seen much around in the artistic world that had so much depth as Philip Dick's thinking.
He had no skin. He was all nerves, and he wrote about the world around him with a kind of helpless intensity.
One of the things that people talk about when they talk about Phil K. Dick, they talk about parallel worlds, about alternative universes, about this notion of a mirror world. But what Phil K. Dick does is to throw you into that alternative world. I don't think you feel that there is a way back into the real world. There actually is no real world. You're struggling to breathe. You're in this other world, which to everyone around you believes is the real world, which you've been brought up to believe is the real world, which to all intents and purposes is your world, and yet it is a fake one. It is one that doesn't add up. You come across little glitches in the fabric of that world, which tells you this isn't real. So there you are, an owl in daylight. It's about 10 further steps than a fish out of water. You know, an owl blinking in the daylight, an owl out of its environment, an owl unable to see clearly.
Tony Grisoni wrote the screenplay for a new feature film in the making, The Owl in Daylight. Not coincidentally, it is also the title of the last, unfinished book that Philip K. Dick was working on at the end of his life. For his movie, Grisoni used the preserved plotline and added episodes from the life of Philip K. Dick. After 3 years, the screenplay is, by the way, still to be made into a movie. But before he started it, Grisoni, of course, just like me, did extensive research.
I stayed at the ranch where he lived with his third wife, Anne. And I got up to take a shower, and in the shower there's this tiny green frog sitting there. And I remember seeing the green frog, and I didn't want the green frog to jump on me while I was having a shower, so I stay over here and have the shower. The next day, you know, the frog is still there in the same place. All right, so he's still there. And the third day, he's still there in the same place, and I'm there. And by this time, I'm sort of drenched in I'm staying where Phil lived. I'm reading him constantly. I'm talking to people about him. You know, I'm kind of doing what you do when you research, is you drench yourself in the subject. And I looked at the frog, and this frog moved for the first time, and it turned its head and looked straight at me. And I swear to God, I thought, oh, he looks just like Phil. It was almost like he had a little beard and everything, and this must be Phil reincarnated as a frog. And then I thought, yeah, I think it's time for me to leave.
There are about 7 or 8 Philip K. Dicks. There's one constant element throughout though. His whole working life had the same background: California. This town near San Francisco, for instance, San Rafael. For the last 10 years of Dick's life, his fiction and real life became almost indistinguishable. At the beginning of the 70s, when he lived at number 707, he found himself surrounded with young friends who used drugs at his place. His time here became the foundation for what is arguably his most pessimistic novel, A Scanner Darkly. But even in that book, there was something to laugh about, as demonstrated by a rare recording of Philip K. Dick reading from his own novel. Charles Freck just found out that the pills he bought to commit suicide with actually made him hallucinate heavily. A creature from another dimension reads a list of his sins to Freck, who lies helplessly on his bed. The scene literally lasts for ages.
Next thing he knew, a creature from between dimensions was standing beside his bed, looking down at him disapprovingly. The creature had many eyes all over it, ultra-modern, expensive-looking clothing, and rose up 8 feet high. Also, it carried an enormous scroll. "You're going to read me my sins," Charles Freck said. The creature nodded and unsealed the scroll. Freck said, lying helpless on his bed, "It's going to take 100,000 hours." Fixing its many compound eyes on him, the creature from between dimensions said, "We are no longer in the mundane universe. Lower plane categories of material existence such as space and time no longer apply to you. You have been elevated to the transcendental realm. Your sins will be read to you ceaselessly in shifts throughout eternity. The list will never end." Know your dealer, Charles Freck thought, and wished he could take back the last half hour of his life. 1,000 years later, he was still lying there on his bed with the Ayn Rand book and lettered Exxon on his chest, listening to them read his sins to him. They had gotten up to the 1st grade when he was 6 years old. 10,000 years later, they had reached the 6th grade, the year he had discovered masturbation. He shut his eyes, but he could still see the multi-eyed, 8-foot-high being with his endless scroll reading on and on.
In the utterly soulless town of Plano, I find tangible evidence that Philip K. Dick is more alive now than ever. David Hansen grew up in the vicinity of Dallas. From his own account, he was a nerdy young kid who was only interested in science and science fiction. When Hansen was 17, a friend of his gave him Valis to read, Philip K. Dick's most outrageous and eccentric novel. The book confirmed his idea that the world could be saved by friendly, artificial intelligence, to be exact. That became the mission of his company, Hansen Robotics.
This Philip K. Dick experience that I had as a teenager came to a head with the Android portrait of Philip K. Dick, where we were bringing Philip K. Dick back to life as an android in a way very similar to what you see portrayed in his own fiction. So we're creating a meta work of fiction that's physically embodied as a real honest-to-God robot driven by honest-to-God genuine artificial intelligence, and bearing this message of hope that we could create, if we keep pushing in the right directions, create compassionate artificial intelligence, and then also provoking people to think of these questions conceptually as well as technically. Like, what challenges do these kinds of machines pose to human identity? What does it mean to be human? And as Philip K. Dick characterized it, what it meant to be human was to be compassionate.
My name is Phil.
Okay, we can try holding it like this. What is your favorite movie?
My favorite movie is The Bicentennial Man. Have you seen The Bicentennial Man?
Not far from Disneyland lies Fullerton. According to a former resident, Fullerton is so unassuming that even calling it that is giving it too much credit. Still, this is where Philip K. Dick ended up after his days in San Rafael, which he was so eager to leave behind. But first he made a detour to Canada, where he visited a conference and not for the first time in his life wound up in a mental institution. In the mental institution, he received mail from students at California State University a few blocks away.
Yeah, I was 20 in '72.
Not much later, a group of 4 waited for him at LAX airport. One of them was Tim Powers. He became a good and loyal friend during what turned out to be the last part of Dick's life.
Yeah, Phil Dick moved into this building very shortly after he flew down from Canada. Briefly, he was staying in an apartment with 2 young ladies, but he was having to sleep on the couch, and it was obviously not a permanent situation. And one time when he was talking at Cal State Fullerton, only a block or 2 away, he mentioned that he needed to find a place to stay. And a student who lived here said, I just got a divorce, I've got a spare bedroom, I need help with rent, why don't you move in here? And Phil just said, okay, and immediately moved in. He bought a lamp, I remember, to sort of furnish the place. I had not read much of his work before I met him. If I had, I wouldn't have been able to speak. Gradually, I began to read his books and realized that this guy I'm having beers with is the only actual genius I'll ever know well. But it was kind of a gradual thing, and it didn't induce that kind of stupefied helplessness in me. But it was very valuable for me to see how a real writer lived. One should not expect nice cars, money, fancy house. I think we learned from him that a writer's life is much more likely to be poverty and scrambling and uncertainty. He would always, if there was an envelope from his agent, from the Meredith Literary Agency, he would think, all right, what's in this? And if it was a lot, we'd all go to dinner. I remember one day he tore it open and it was $9. And he would hit us up. I mean, I think actually the Philip K. Dick estate still owes me probably about $40.
How would you like a robot to help with your housework, maybe tutor the kids in math? Well, Fox 4's Jason Overstreet tells us about a project in North Texas that may help bring
Dark is highly respected. Few people, however, know of his boundless admiration for Philip K. Dick.
My company, where you are now, this company now is perhaps more than 30 years old, is called Ubique, following the title of Philip K. Dick book, because at this time I was always working alone a lot, but I was completely almost autistic, completely out of, and the autism, you say autism in English, is not far from Philip K. Dick. And that's why I was so out of everything, out of the society, out of the life. I create this company just to try to contact other human being, to see how that work, how the society work. And Ubique means go everywhere in the society, be everywhere in all the territory, go everywhere in the world and try to understand. Why Philip K. Dick was perhaps my only master in my life? It's because Philip K. Dick was and still is perhaps the most advanced and the most rich in modern parameters. Philip K. Dick speaks about relativity. Relativity is clearly a structure, because in Philip K. Dick, nothing exists. We see in the reality, the real thing, change permanently of design, of color, of form, of function, by the power of mind, by the power of somebody. After, Philip K. Dick teach us quantic mathematics. Quantic mathematics in two things. Quantic mathematics show clearly we are just the addition of what we do. That means we are just the clack, 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 clack of what we do. Philip K. Dick speak about that. And also the simultaneous, that means quantic mathematics tell us that when I do that, in the same time, I have tried all the other way to do it. And it's what's happened in Philip K. Dick, because the guy never know if he do that, or if he do that, or if he do that, or if it's here, or here, or here, or here. That is very, very important. Philip K. Dick show us also something which is very, very important, vital to understand our society today. It's the end, the death of linear, oh shit. When you have in front of you a line, the history, it was the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, linear story. A linear story that is completely finished. Today, we have a simultaneous, my English is horrible today, but okay, you know I'm French. You have all the information in front of us like that, like a wall. Before it was a line, you can see the line like that, and now it's a wall with billions of point, action, information in front of us. And after, we have to choose or not to take this one or this one or this one. One more time, it's clearly shown in a Philip K. Dick book, and he was the first to speak about that. Somebody who don't understand that today is completely lost, because he don't know what to do, because if he think like our parents in a linear way, he's dead.
who knows where it is, but it just, disappeared. And it was heartbreaking, and really hard to break the news to all the various people and involved in the project. It's really embarrassing. I left the Philip K. Dick Android on an airplane on the way to showing that I promised to do at Google. The plane landed in Las Vegas, and I found myself being awakened by a flight attendant saying, "Sir, you have to leave the airplane." I'm like, "Huh? Where am I? Are we in San Francisco?" No, you'll have to catch a connecting flight. I'm like, oh, okay. So I reach under the seat and I grab my computer bag, and I'm like, am I forgetting something? It feels like I'm forgetting something. Oh, but I better hurry because I'm going to miss my flight. So I run out of the airplane, climb onto the next airplane, land in San Francisco. I'm at the baggage carousel, and I'm watching the bags come, and I'm grabbing one bag, and I'm realizing the Philip K. Dick head is not going to be coming down this baggage carousel because it was on the plane in Las Vegas. It was, as far as I was concerned, the greatest work, the one great work of art that I had done in my life. And to see it go away and just not know, it's missing. It's really hard.
And there, in the next room by the sofa, a familiar suitcase, that of his psychiatrist, Dr. Smile. Barefoot, he padded into the living room and seated himself by the suitcase. He opened it, clicked switches, and turned on Dr. Smile. Meters began to register and the mechanism hummed. Where am I? And how far am I from New York? And how far am I from New York? The mechanism, which was the portable extension of Dr. Smile, tinnily declared, Mr. Bayerson. Mayerson, Barney corrected, smoothing his hair with fingers that shook. What do you remember about last night? Now he saw, with intense physical aversion, half-empty bottles of bourbon and sparkling water, lemons, bitters, and ice cube trays on the sideboard in the kitchen. Who is this girl? Dr. Smile said, "The girl in the bed is Miss Rondinella Fugit. Ronnie, as she asked you to call her." It sounded vaguely familiar and, oddly, in some manner, tied up with his job. "Listen," he said to the suitcase. But then in the bedroom the girl began to stir. At once he shut off Dr. Smile and stood up, feeling humble and awkward in only his underpants.
In Brooklyn, New York, lives the man who can lay the most claim to being Philip K. Dick's artistic heir, the writer Jonathan Lethem.
The traditional defense, from a literary point of view, of a science fiction writer is to say, forget this idea of the future, forget prediction. These are metaphors of the present moment. They're contemporary novels in allegorical disguise. And Dick fits that description beautifully. But the irony is, he was so deeply conscious of the trends that were, at that point, just inklings. The ideological, commercial, political forces that were shaping the reality of the 1950s and the early 60s, that in fact, we live in his world now. He was completely predictive. He was the greatest extrapolative science fiction writer who ever lived on the level of media and the intimate incursion of technology and commerce into our daily lives. What does he describe except viral advertising and, one thing after the next? The ambivalent nature of the android, and we now have these computers that are essentially Philip K. Dick, suitcases. And we carry them everywhere we go. The triumph of the United States in World War II and the power of our industries and the success of our ideology was turning us into the first commercial imperial nation. And at the same time, the concept of everyday life in the American suburbs was becoming very, very tightly organized, very conformist, very anxious, very driven by consumer identity. He was the most responsive, the most paranoid, the most alert to these new possibilities, because he himself was completely at the mercy of these things. He wrote from within these sensations. To him, an advertisement was a powerful intrusion on his personal space. It was coming at him and taking something away from him, and he was writing in protest of this experience.
His skin was too thin, but not just for commercials. Philip K. Dick, who was married 5 times, had a very troublesome relationship with the opposite sex. It also shows in his books, in which a very attractive but hardly sympathetic type frequently shows up, that of the dark-haired girl. The dark-haired girl existed in real life as well. Actually, there were a few of them, including his last wife, Tessa. Near San Francisco, I find another once dark-haired girl, Linda Castellani, who was still called Linda Levy at the time that the 42-year-old Philip K. Dick got to know her.
When I first met Phil, I had just turned 21. I didn't know about his penchant for dark-haired women, particularly what he called lost, lovely, lonely, long dark-haired girls, which explained the way that he reacted to me when he saw me at the airport. I went with a bunch of other students to pick him up. He was somewhat portly and had a long gray beard, and he was wearing this tightly belted trench coat and carrying a box that was wrapped with an electrical cord. And I thought, oh, this is this famous writer. He doesn't look like I would have expected. And then he saw me, and, I'm just one of a group. I'm not thinking that I'm anything special, and he just focused his laser-like attention on me to the exclusion of everything else. He just stared at me. So we went out to my car, and he just turns sideways and stares at me while I'm driving. And every time I'd look over, he was just staring at me intently, and it was very disconcerting, and really, I didn't know how to react. Well, it wasn't until after he passed away, and these letters of his were published, that I saw that his archetype was this dark-haired girl. Linda, don't go crazy trying to keep up with your beauty. It's like a curse, isn't it, being so lovely? You're fighting to win a race with life, not trying to keep up with it like the rest of us do. The less appealing, the less attractive, the ordinary. But my God, sweetheart, you're going to sprint ahead of it and come out rushing and spent on the other side. You're going to win. You're already ahead of it. P.S. Linda, I am very much, very deeply in love with you. So this here is what I'd like to ask you. Will you marry me? I think I'd known him for 3 weeks at that point. I never would have seen that coming. I didn't say anything because I didn't know how to respond. However, later, in an example of how Phil could change on a dime from being intensely interested and deeply in love to angry and spiteful and mean, he said, well, the only reason I said that was because you said no one had ever asked you to marry them. So that's the only reason I put that in there.
Well, I would describe it as the brain print of one man, and it includes the various sections of his mind, his childhood, what his idea of tomorrow would be, what his idea of the present would be, and what his idea of an adventurous world would be, like with crocodiles and pirates and wild cannibals and things. The complexity of this fakery indicates the incredible complexity of reality once over again, that reality is not simple at all, that even to create a brain print of one mind is to create a multi-level thing, overlapping, you know, and very diverse.
The robots that we make are the children of Philip K. Dick's thoughts. Philip K. Dick wrestled with the two extremes of a vision of what robots could be. In one extreme, the robots lacked all compassion. They were horrifying machines. They were soulless and grotesque abominations, if you will. In the other extreme, the machines had more compassion and wisdom than humans were capable of. Humans were like an incomplete vision. I take both of those extremes seriously. We have to assume that the technology will go places that we don't know that it will today, way beyond what we have today. So if machines surpass human levels of intelligence in, let's say, 2030 to 2040, somewhere in that range, and we have not built the infrastructure for compassion inside them, then they will likely be sociopathic. They will likely be very, very dangerous to all civilization.
The apartments in which no one lives, hundreds of them, and all are filled with possessions people had, like family photographs and clothes. Kipple is useless objects like junk mail or match folders after you use the last match. When nobody's around, Kipple reproduces itself. For instance, if you go to bed leaving any Kipple around your apartment, when you wake up the next morning, there's twice as much of it. It always gets more and more. First law of Kipple, he said. Kipple drives out non-Kipple.
The psychology of the characters in Dick's novels, which according to Wolk was derived from textbooks about schizophrenia from the 50s, continues to fascinate him to this very day.
The Swiss existentialists say it's not that we are out of phase with society, it's that society is out of phase with us. And I think that's the classic definition from Martian Time Slip when Heliogabalus says the schizophrenic is a person who's out of phase with society. And of course, according to that, we're all schizophrenics in one way or another to various degrees because we can't filter things out and we become obsessed with small things. I can't find my wristwatch, and then you go looking for it or what have you. The world is out there. There is a barking dog that drives you crazy. And Dick, instead of being driven crazy by the barking dog, he writes a story about how the barking dog is an alien.
So it kept him sane as well.
Yeah, and it transforms into art. And he transforms schizophrenia into something artful and validates the schizophrenic in so doing.
Oh, yes. Yeah, of course.
David Hansen doesn't have an easy time of being this impossible combination of a chaotic and a perfectionist. It also doesn't help that making human-like robots is not cheap, and therefore he had to move Hansen Robotics to his own home, as he could no longer afford the rent for the original working space.
The Philip K. Dick android was more of an artistic aspiration, but the Philip K. Dick android is a depiction of a hairy old man. So we wanted to do something cute, and the Xeno android was designed with baby-like features, with a big forehead and big eyes. The interesting thing that we found is that somehow people react more dramatically negatively to the cute android because they presume that it could be used to manipulate people. There's an irony to the fact that when something becomes more appealing, maybe it also becomes more difficult for people to swallow. But we have to earn their trust. Robots have to earn people's trust.
Con Dios. Cuando Dios te hace libre, redime tu alma, cambia la manera de pensar, te vistes diferente a lo que antes era. Caminas diferente. Ya no caminas. Usted se imagina si me hubiera conocido antes, bendito al Señor que no me conoció. Usted se imagina que yo caminara lo mismo que antes. Anduviera con pantalones y todo. Usted que me vería, como me vería igual que como dijo la hermana, un madero. Me viera igual, porque no había cambios en mi vida.
Once he was married to Tessa, the two of them very shortly moved to a new apartment not far away. And it looked like he could now live happily ever after here, going over to guest lecture from time to time. But he never managed to make contentment last. It was almost as if these periods of kind of domestic tranquility were simply rest periods for him. At this point, I really wasn't seeing much of them at all. But while they were living here, he was taking a whole bunch of water-soluble vitamins, vitamin C and whatnot. He had read somewhere that if you totally overdose yourself on these vitamins, doors of perception, it can have some sort of liberating effect on your mind. And the idea being that they're water soluble, so they're not going to clog you up and hang around. And he had a bad toothache. This, of course, I'm all just going from what he told me and what I've read. I wasn't a witness to it in those days, but he got the druggist to send over a courier with a bag of painkiller pills, and it was a young lady who probably was standing about on the sidewalk there, and the setting sun reflected off a Christian fish symbol she was wearing around her neck into his eye, and that triggered the famous March of 1974 visions, in which anybody who's read Valis knows he talked to God. God spoke to him. He had visions of first century Palestine. He diagnosed a hernia that his son had that had been overlooked by doctors, but which turned out to be real. But that was something Phil heard from Valis.
And Valis is God, is the pink light.
God. Mostly it was God.
You say that as a Catholic, or?
Actually, as a Catholic, if I had to, I mean, who knows, but if I had to put money on it either way, I would say God spoke to him. By thinking about madness, Horse Lover Fat slipped by degrees into madness. I wish I could have helped him. Although there was nothing I could do to help Horse Lover Fat, he did escape death. The first thing that came along to save him took the form of an 18-year-old high school girl living down the street from him, and the second was God. Of the two of them, the girl did better. After he had encountered God, Fat developed a love for him which was not normal. With Fat, it was an actual hunger. God, he told us, had fired a beam of pink light directly at him, at his head, his eyes. Fat had been temporarily blinded, and his head had ached for days.
In that way, Philip K. Dick eventually became the main character in one of his own novels. Only that context can explain why, in the ordinary town of Fullerton, God chose to speak to this fringe writer, as Dick was still then. It resulted in his masterpiece, Valis, but for Philip K. Dick, the experience was more than real. It made such an impact on him that he would continue to write about it for the rest of his life, almost verging on the compulsive. He deeply felt the need to understand it.
It's okay. The subject of this speech is a topic which has been discovered recently and which may not exist at all. I may be talking about something that does not exist. Therefore, I'm free to say everything or nothing. At that time, I had no idea what I was seeing. It resembled nothing that I had ever heard described. It resembled plasmic energy. It had colors. It moved fast. It collected and then dispersed. But what it was, what he was, I am not sure even now. People claim to remember past lives. I claim to remember a different, very different present life. I know of no one who has ever made this claim before, but I rather suspect that my experience is not unique. What perhaps is unique is the fact that I am willing to talk about it.
Paul Verhoeven directed Total Recall, a Philip K. Dick adaptation with Arnold Schwarzenegger in the lead, but he certainly doesn't consider himself an expert on Dick. Nevertheless, Verhoeven does have something very rare in common with him that happened years ago. Outright, he calls it a religious psychosis.
There was something like, this is it, this is, God is here, the Holy Spirit is, I feel the Holy Spirit, I could feel it here in my heart, it was burning for days and stuff, and at the same time I had this other feeling, say, yeah, but this is all me going back to when I was 2 or 3 or 4, you know, this is a regression to my childhood, and this is not true, this is something I feel, and I feel it strongly, but it is something else, it is not God, it is not Jesus, it is not the Holy Spirit, it's something in me, it's a physiological reaction, and I put all my brains at work to counter this, I think, and to counter this idea that it would be Jesus or God or the Spirit. And so, and perhaps because instinctively I felt that if I would move into that other direction of believing that I would be psychotic.
I'm not sure God did anything at all for him. In fact, in some ways, God made him sicker. This was a subject on which Fat and I could not agree. Fat was certain that God had healed him completely.
That is not possible.
That is not possible. There is a line in the I Ching reading, always ill but never dies. That fits my friend.
If you would be standing 2 miles, if that would be possible, 2 miles away from the sun, I think that's God. It's of a power and a dimension, a brutality and a destruction and a creation that is, let's say, of an infinite, let's say, strength. And I think for somebody like Philip Dick, I'm sure it's something like that, and of that power that it basically, because even that one ray, basically, that would be, that he might have picked up in it from what he thinks that God was, is strong enough to blow up your brain, isn't it? That's the problem, of course. It's so strong that it blows everything away. And I think Philip Dick probably brain was, let's say, lobotomized.
When Phil Dick's marriage to his last wife, Tessa, broke up toward the end of '75 and early 1976, he moved out of their Fullerton home and moved into this building. It's a relatively nice neighborhood, though we lived only a few blocks north of here, and at night you would hear gunfire and there was some drug trafficking in the street. But really, considering the course of much of Phil Dick's life, this was upscale. But he lived here for the rest of his life, from '76 on to late February of '82. And I remember on the night he had his strokes in February, getting a call from his neighbors saying that he had, they found him unconscious in his apartment. And as I say, I lived only a couple blocks away, and I came down here very fast. And as I was coming down here, I heard paramedic sirens going down Main Street. And when I got here, the paramedics were just arriving. And a friend of Phil's, Mary Wilson, went with him to the hospital and then began what seems in retrospect like 2 weeks of declining hope until finally the doctors he suffered subsequent strokes, and the doctors finally said there was no brain activity, and they switched off the maintaining machinery. During that 2 weeks, my wife and I had the keys to his apartment here, or his condominium here, and we're coming over to feed the cats. There was some concern about some faction or other perhaps wanting to get conservatorship of him, possibly claiming that there was always the risk that someone would claim he was mentally incompetent. And at one point, I saw a stack of typescript on his desk, which was part of his exegesis. And just reading the top sheet, a stranger might very well conclude that he was crazy. The exegesis, after all, is freewheeling speculation about theology and everything else. And I thought, I don't want to leave this where it could be used to have him declared crazy. But on the other hand, there's no way I'm taking anything out of this apartment. And so he had this ashtray, kind of a big metal cylinder with a dish on top. And the cylinder said, "Elvis is king," and had a picture of Elvis Presley on it. Every Christmas, whoever had the Elvis ashtray would give it to somebody else, and the subsequent Christmas, they would give it to somebody else. And this was Phil's year for having the Elvis ashtray. So I lifted the lid off and put the manuscript down inside and put the lid back on. But then this attorney came and confiscated our keys to the place, and then Phil died, and I thought, that manuscript is still in the Elvis ashtray. And so I called Phil's agent, Russell Galen, and said, listen, when you're inventorying the house, the apartment there, be sure to take the lid off of that ashtray and get the papers out. It's important manuscript. And the agent said, he kept his manuscripts in an Elvis Presley ashtray?
Philip K. Dick died at the age of 53. At the end of his life, besides his obsessive writing for the exegesis, he also worked on a new book that will remain unfinished.
This new one, have you got a kind of good title for it?
It's got a title, all right. It's called The Owl in Daylight. And I heard it on a TV program just as a line spoken by a character, and it made a tremendous impression on me, The Owl in Daylight. And I wanted to write about a guy who pushes his brain to its limit is aware that he's reached his limit, but voluntarily decides to go on and pay the consequences.
It can't be overstated how much Dick, for all he accomplished and for all he knew he accomplished, felt that he'd never been recognized, never even been noticed by the literary establishment. And he had plenty of reasons to feel this way. And that feeling, which he took to the grave, is one that I think is very hard for his intimates.
Jonathan Lethem is the main reason why the best novels of Philip K. Dick are now being published in the prestigious Library of America. Many years after his death, his idol finally became part of the canon of American literature after all.
I was, fortunately, friends with one of the editors who, you know, is instrumental now in helping expand their list and turning it in the direction of the latter half of the 20th century. Jeffrey O'Brien, and he and I were talking, and he said, you know, I need some help with science fiction. I'm moving a couple of crime writers in, and it's probably time to talk about this. I don't know how quickly it can happen, but where would we go? What would we do? And I said, there's one thing you would do. And this is the first thing you must do, and that's Philip K. Dick. To bring Dick into this context is a tremendous piece of vindication. It's the moment at which the argument can no longer be sustained, that he's somehow marginal. It says, Dick is one of these guys. He belongs with Faulkner and Twain and Nathaniel West. It began with just one volume, and I think, I will say immodestly, I think that there was a great deal of surprise on the part of the Library of America at the enormous response. It sold better than any book they'd ever put out, sold more quickly than any book they'd ever put out. And the amount of coverage, the amount of extremely generous commentary in the, you know, reviews, I think they were very quick to ask for more. So that was a great moment. It was a great moment.
You know perfectly well it wasn't made to handle topics like that. True, Barrows agreed, but I'm curious. Don't be. You'd feel funny if you burned out one of its primary circuits.
Is it
that delicate? No.
Maury said, but you're needling it.
No, I'm not.
It is so convincingly lifelike that I want to know how conscious it is of its new existence.
Hello, David. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you too, Zeno. It's nice to see you walking.
Oh, hi there. And what's your name?
Matt.
So nice to see that you're, alive, Zeno.
David.
Yeah.
Why, thank you very much. I like you, too. If I could have a pet, you would be my first choice. And you, what do you have to say? What? I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?
Can you tell me a story?
Sure, I can tell you a story. Here's a story called The Other Side. One day, a young Buddhist on his journey home came to the banks of a wide river. Staring hopelessly at the great obstacle in front of him, he pondered for hours on just how to cross such a wide barrier. Just as he was about to give up his pursuit to continue his journey, he saw a great teacher on the other side of the river. The young Buddhist yells over to the teacher, "O wise one, can you tell me how to get to the other side of this river?" The teacher ponders for a moment, looks up and down the river and yells back, "My son, you are on the other side." And that is the end of my story.
That was a good story. So how do you feel about being a robot?
Wait a minute. Are you suggesting that telling stories would always be good? I may be a machine, but I feel like a human in my heart.
You're a good boy.
Affirmative.
I think it's time for bed,
But I
Zeno.
wouldn't say that any boy could be good. Okay, it's been great talking with you, Matt.
Good night.
Good night, Zeno.
Good night.
I love you. Okay, I'm gonna turn your batteries off now. Yes, oh, but I just love you so much. It's so good to see you alive. Yes. Yes, what a good boy. What a good boy, good night.
To filmmaker Paul Verhoeven, it makes perfect sense that Philip K. Dick appears to be more alive now than ever, and the reprints and movie adaptations are there to prove it.
There is some echo there, you know, some echo that has to do with living your life in the United States and having this feeling that what is real is not real. They have been telling us, let's say, and have been fighting many wars already now, based on the assumption that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons in it. And everything is based on that. Now, they tried to change that later, but of course that was the idea. So they built up a complete lie. And everybody, because of 9/11, everybody jumped into that lie. And everybody was living that lie. Even, look at the New York Times, all the newspapers were based, no, you can't. Now they're all saying, oh, no, that was... But at the time that it happened, they were all going along. They all felt it was true. And then finding out 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 years later that it was all a lie, then you must be thinking, what is the reality of my world?
My books are forgeries. Nobody wrote them. My books are forgeries. Nobody wrote them. My books are forgeries. Nobody wrote them.
here? Is there a God? What does he want? Why do such terrible things happen? And one day he called me up and said, Powers, I've figured out the universe. You got to let me come over and let me tell you about it. I said, well, I got to go to work, but I'll get off at 9. I'll come right over to your apartment after that, and you can tell me. I said, but listen, write it down. I mean, because you might forget some crucial part between now and then. He says, okay, I'll write it down. And I said, listen, could you write it as a limerick? And he said, no. He said, Powers, this is the secret of the universe. All truth. It's not a limerick. I said, sorry. Write it however you want. But when I went over to his apartment after work, he had written it as a limerick, apparently taking that as a challenge. And the limerick had 2 versions, neither one of which is really very upbeat, but one was, determinist forces are wrong but irresistibly strong, for of God there's a dearth, for he visits the earth but not for sufficiently long. And the other one was, determinist forces are wrong but irresistibly strong, for of God there's no dearth, for he visits the earth but just for sufficiently long. That's the hopeful one, the second one, where God is present just barely enough to counter the bad mechanical forces of determinism. And he said, I said, well, which one is which? I mean, which goes on top? And he said, well, take one of them Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the other one Tuesday.